She flails in the violent current, convinced she's seconds from drowning. When the feared stallion plunges in at her side, she wonders if he's come to save her or seal her fate as the torrent forces them both under. Under the blistering midday sun, a crowd gathered by the edge of the old wooden fence that ran alongside Briar Creek Ranch. Dust swirled in the scorching heat as farmhands wrestled with heavy feed sacks, their faces flushed from relentless labor. Amid the commotion, a tall bay stallion named Storm stood tethered to a post, his eyes flashing with unmistakable defiance. An unsettling rumor clung to him like a stubborn shadow. Storm was dangerous, prone to sudden fits of rage, and no one dared approach him without a thick rope or a sturdy fence in between. Each morning, local ranchers muttered warnings, recounting tales of a rearing, bucking horse who had already injured two stable hands. The ranch's foreman, a wary older man named Reuben, insisted Storm be kept under lock and key. The beast was a liability, Reuben grumbled, too unpredictable for the gentle riders or the docile mares that roamed the property. Only one person seemed unafraid, 12-year-old Clara, the ranch owner's daughter. She was a slender girl with braided auburn hair that danced around her shoulders whenever she sped off on her pony. But even her father had forbidden her from going near Storm, who eyed everyone with seething suspicion. One afternoon, as thunderheads gathered ominously on the horizon, Clara found herself lingering by the far paddock fence. She heard Storm's agitated snorts and saw him pawing the ground, clearly on edge from the thick, humid air that signaled an approaching storm. She inched closer, ignoring her better judgment and her father's explicit warnings. Whenever Storm turned those intense brown eyes toward her, she felt an odd mixture of awe and compassion. It was true the horse looked fierce, but beneath his bared teeth and pinned-back ears, Clara sensed something else, a profound fear, perhaps a memory of past mistreatment that kept him locked in a cycle of aggression. She reached out her hand, speaking softly, but Storm shook his mane and let out a warning neigh. Startled, Clara stumbled backward, heart pounding. She retreated quickly, aware that she had overstepped. Yet she couldn't shake the thought that Storm wasn't simply cruel. There was a reason for his rage, a story she longed to uncover. Even as the sky rumbled overhead, she couldn't dismiss the image of his flaring nostrils and restless hooves, as though he, too, braced for an oncoming tempest. Early the next morning, Clara's father, Everett, rose before dawn to survey the ranch's routine. With a thoughtful sigh, he walked past Storm's stall, noticing the horse's restless pacing. Everett shook his head, recalling how Storm had arrived months ago, purchased cheaply at an auction where no one else had dared bid. The seller had offhandedly mentioned Storm's violent outbursts, but no details beyond that cryptic warning. Everett had planned to rehabilitate him, hoping the stallion might prove a fine steed for ranch work or even for Clara one day. But after the injuries to two stable hands and countless close calls, fear had overshadowed the initial optimism. Pausing by the stall door, Everett saw Storm's ears flatten at his approach and the horse's entire body tensed. Despite a flicker of pity, Everett muttered his frustration. Maybe Reuben was right. Maybe Storm was a lost cause. Lost in thought, he turned away, missing the moment when Storm's ears pricked forward at the sound of his footsteps receding. There was a silent question in the horse's gaze, an unspoken longing for understanding that no one had yet managed to grasp, but locked in their own fears, none at Briar Creek Ranch noticed. Days passed, and with them came an unusual streak of summer storms that drenched the ranch in a deluge of rain. Briar Creek, usually a gentle ribbon of water meandering through the fields, transformed into a churning force of muddy currents. The ranch hands struggled to keep track of supplies, rescue stranded cattle, and repair fences battered by wind and floodwaters. In the chaos, Clara slipped away one evening, drawn to the rush of the swollen creek. Standing at its bank, she marveled at the force of nature, feeling her heart race with both excitement and trepidation. She had grown up around these fields and was no stranger to the creek's gentle flow. But she had never seen it this high, this wild. The roar of the water was hypnotic, and she inched closer, her boots squishing in the mud. Suddenly, the earth beneath her feet gave way, sending her sliding down the slick bank. Clara's scream pierced the stormy air as she fought to find a grip, but the muddy slope offered none. Before she could react, the rushing current had swallowed her entire figure, leaving nothing but a frantic swirl of disturbed water in its wake. At that exact moment, Storm stood in a small corral near the stable, rain lashing against his flanks. He was restless, ears flicking at every crack of thunder. In the distance, he heard Clara's scream, a sharp, desperate cry that sent a jolt through his powerful body. For reasons no human could fully comprehend, Storm reared up and tore free from the flimsy rope that bound him. The stable hands shouted in alarm, but Storm paid no heed. Like an unstoppable force, the stallion galloped across the pasture, hooves pounding against the mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating his muscular frame. On any other day, such a sight would strike fear into any onlooker, but tonight there was a haunting purpose in the way Storm carried himself. Following the sound and the sudden hush that followed Clara's disappearance, Storm charged toward the creek. A fallen tree blocked part of the path, but the stallion soared over it, fueled by adrenaline. The ranch hands, initially stunned, sprinted after him, yelling for help. Through the sheets of rain, they witnessed something they could scarcely believe. Storm plunging into the raging waters, ears pinned back, eyes wide, as though determined to fight the current itself. Clara had never felt such terror. The water battered her, pulling her under again and again. She gasped, coughing out muddy liquid, limbs flailing in search of any branch or debris that might keep her afloat. The realization that she was truly alone, caught in nature's unrelenting grip, threatened to swallow her hope. She opened her mouth to scream, but only swallowed more water. Then, through the torrential roar, came a sudden commotion. Hooves splashing, a fierce neigh, and the massive, dark silhouette of Storm. In that delirious moment, Clara could hardly believe what she saw. The very horse, rumored to be a killer, the one everyone feared, now braved the same torrent that threatened to take her life. Summoning a final burst of energy, Clara reached out. Storm thrashed in the surging current, positioning himself close enough for her to grab his thick mane. Lightning flared, revealing the intensity in Storm's eyes. He snorted, fighting the weight of the water, his massive chest cutting through waves. With every labored breath, he surged forward, dragging Clara along by sheer force. Though her vision blurred, Clara felt a surge of relief. She clung to Storm like a lifeline, aware that her survival hinged on his unyielding resolve. Meanwhile, the ranch hands stood aghast on the riverbank, brandishing lanterns that flickered in the relentless downpour. Everett arrived moments later, heart pounding, as he scanned the murky water for any sign of his daughter. He spotted Storm's struggling silhouette and recognized, to his astonishment, that Clara was with him. Thunder rumbled overhead, but Everett's attention was riveted on the impossible scene unfolding before his eyes. The horse deemed too dangerous, risking everything to save the child. A trembling hush fell over the group. Everyone realized, in that instant, that the line between fear and heroism is often thinner than anyone imagines. Everett splashed into the water, half blinded by the storm's fury. But it was obvious that Storm had reached Clara before any human could. The stallion's muscles strained against the raging current, and though his body fought to stay afloat, he refused to abandon the girl clinging to his mane. Lightning crashed overhead in a terrifying pulse of white. For an instant, Everett saw a vivid image, his little girl's pale face resting against Storm's heaving flank. That final shock of illumination guided him as he waded deeper, arms outstretched. His boots snagged on underwater debris, and twice he nearly went under, but he pressed forward, desperate to reach his daughter. At last, his hand brushed Clara's soaked sleeve. Grasping her with trembling arms, Everett hauled her toward the shallows, while Storm flailed alongside them, neighing in defiance of the swirling flood. By the time Everett dragged Clara onto the muddy bank, the thunder was retreating into the distance, and Storm had found his footing enough to lurch out of the creek. The horse stood panting, sides quivering, water streaming from his mane and tail. Wet and winded, father and horse locked eyes. In that shared gaze, a silent understanding passed between them. An unthinkable alliance formed in the face of disaster. Clara was conscious but weak, coughing up muddy water as Everett cradled her in his arms. Her small body shook with chills beneath the downpour. Ranch hands rushed to their side, forming a tense circle around the extraordinary scene. Storm stood there, no rope, no fence, only a few feet away from the men who had once called him a monster. Mud streaked his glossy bay coat, and a cut on his foreleg bled into the soggy ground. Yet his expression was eerily calm, ears flicking as though assessing whether Clara was finally safe. The stable workers exchanged astonished looks. Even Reuben, who'd repeatedly insisted that Storm was nothing but trouble, stood slack-jawed, tipping his drenched hat back to wipe rainwater from his brow. The hush of collective awe was broken only by Clara's ragged breaths and the relentless patter of rain. Finally, Reuben cleared his throat, shouting instructions to gather blankets and call for the ranch's doctor. As two workers sprinted toward the truck, Storm snorted loudly, stepping closer to Clara despite Everett's presence. Everett tensed, instinctively expecting aggression, but Storm merely lowered his muzzle, as if checking on the girl he had just saved. No one dared speak. The only sound was the distant rumble of thunder rolling away. They bundled Clara in warm blankets and raced her to the ranch house. Storm followed them part way, but then hesitated near the barn, uncertain of where he was allowed to go. A few wranglers tried to coax him to a stall, anxious to tend to the wound on his leg. Yet the horse skittered sideways, glancing anxiously at the house, as if tethered by an invisible thread to the girl he had rescued. Eventually, Reuben stepped in, speaking gently, keeping his gestures calm and unthreatening. He understood that Storm's adrenaline still surged hot through his veins, making the powerful stallion edgy and unpredictable. Stepping back to give him space, the men led Storm indoors with patient encouragement. Inside the barn, they secured him in the largest stall at the far end, offering fresh hay and water. Though trembling from exertion, Storm showed no signs of turning violent. Instead, he paced the stall, ears pricked toward any noise from outside. By lantern light, a young stable hand named Marcus dabbed antiseptic on the gash near Storm's foreleg. Expecting trouble, he winced, anticipating a kick or a snap of teeth. But Storm stood so still, it was disconcerting. In the flickering glow, Marcus could see the stallion's eyes, usually so cold and wild, brimming with something almost like worry. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered in hushed awe. "We'll take care of you." Meanwhile, the ranch house bustled with fearful urgency. Clara lay curled on a couch beside the crackling fireplace, her face ashen, but her breaths steadier now. Wrapped in quilts, she drank the hot tea her mother pressed into her hands. Everett knelt nearby, thankful beyond words, but still trembling with residual terror. He replayed the day's events in his mind. how close he'd come to losing his daughter, and how the horse everyone mistrusted had leaped into the deadly waters. The sight of Storm fighting the current alongside Clara felt etched into his memory, a moment of extraordinary bravery he could scarcely believe. When the doctor arrived, he examined Clara thoroughly, pronouncing that aside from a low-grade fever and some bruises, she'd survive without permanent harm. As exhaustion overcame her, Clara drifted into a restless sleep, her father never leaving her side. Outside, the storm clouds finally broke, revealing a moonlit sky that shimmered across the flooded fields. Before the sun rose, the news of Storm's remarkable act had already spread among the ranch hands and would soon reach the small town nearby. Back in the barn, the stable was strangely peaceful. Storm dozed in the straw, waking every so often to flick his ears at the slightest sound. Reuben and Marcus took turns checking on him, half expecting a return of his temper now that the dramatic rescue was over. Yet the horse seemed subdued, drained of his former hostility, as though the night's ordeal had stripped away layers of distrust. It didn't escape Reuben's notice that Storm kept gazing toward the barn door, as if waiting for someone. Eventually, after the first rays of daylight snuck past the rafters, Reuben shook his head and chuckled under his breath. "He wants to see Clara," he murmured to Marcus. "He's not going to settle till he knows she's okay." Clara awoke to her mother humming softly, tending to the soup on the stove. Her entire body felt heavy, yet there was a curious warmth in her heart that transcended her lingering aches. Drowsy and still shaken, she recalled the sensation of being swept away by the creek, choking on water, convinced she would never draw another breath. But then there had been Storm, the wild, misunderstood stallion, eyes blazing in the storm's gloom. She remembered how his mane felt between her fingers, the thick strands clutched in her fist, as he fought the current to keep her above the surface. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized she owed her life to him. Pulling the blankets aside, Clara tried to stand, only to have her mother rush over. "You need rest," her mother scolded gently, guiding her back down. Clara swallowed, her voice raspy. Is Storm all right?" she asked. Her mother nodded, forcing a smile. "He's fine." "A bit scratched up, but Reuben's taking good care of him." Clara closed her eyes in relief, pressing a shaking hand to her forehead. She needed to see him, to thank him in her own way. But her mother insisted she wait until the fever subsided. After all, the water had been cold, and Clara's body needed time to recover. Storm's renown at the ranch changed overnight. Men who had once regarded him with fear could not stop discussing his daring rescue. Marcus, enthralled by the story, recounted every detail he'd witnessed. How Storm broke free, how unstoppable he'd been, the unwavering focus in his eyes as he dove into the current. Reuben listened, nodding along, still baffled. "Maybe," Reuben suggested one morning, "it was instinct. Horses can sense distress." But even as he tried to rationalize it, his expression betrayed the awe he felt. Everyone knew horses could panic in storms, bolt from trouble, or step on a rattlesnake without flinching. But to leap into a flooded creek to save a child, that went beyond mere instinct. It spoke of something else inside Storm, something that defied the logic of those who branded him vicious. Everett, too, was transformed. He still harbored caution. Storm was, by all accounts, large, powerful, and capable of violence if panicked. Yet the father who had once avoided the stallion's paddock now found himself hovering near that very enclosure, grappling with gratitude and guilt. Guilt, because he'd almost given up on Storm without trying to understand him, and gratitude, because Storm had saved the one life Everett treasured above all else. 2 days later, Clara woke feeling stronger. Her fever had dropped, and though her head still throbbed if she moved too fast, she could manage short walks around the house. Ignoring her mother's objections, she wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and slipped outside into the crisp morning air. The ranch was soggy from the storms, deep puddles reflecting bits of the early sunlight. She made her way toward the barn, each step a reminder of how easily life could be upended. When she reached Storm's stall, she hesitated, recalling how many times she'd been warned away. But a greater force, the recollection of his strong neck in the rushing water, pushed her forward. At first, Storm didn't notice her, busy munching on a flake of fresh hay. Then he stopped mid-chew, ears twitching at the soft sound of her footsteps. Clara inched closer, pressing a trembling hand against the stall door. Storm raised his head, strands of hay falling from his mouth. For a moment, Clara's heart pounded. Would he pin his ears or stamp in alarm? Instead, the horse stepped nearer, lowering his muzzle cautiously. Clara swallowed, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice barely rose above the rustle of straw. Storm huffed a gentle breath as if in reply. With deliberate care, Clara slid the bolt and slipped inside. Her father and Reuben, watching from the barn's entry, felt their own breath catch, worried Storm might revert to his old aggression. But the stallion let Clara approach. His dark eyes seemed calm, reflecting her slight, quivering form. She touched his muzzle, feeling the soft warmth of his breath against her palm. It was the first time she had ever laid a hand on him without a barrier between them, and for a second, the magnitude of that trust overwhelmed her. Standing there in the straw, Clara took in every detail of the stallion's scars and the fresh bandage around his foreleg. It pained her to see the wound, but also reminded her how he'd risked that leg and his entire life to pull her from the raging creek. Storm's ears flicked back, then forward again, gauging her intentions, but he showed no sign of fright or anger. Something within him had changed, unlocked by that moment in the water when a frightened child had needed him more than she feared him. Clara pressed her forehead to Storm's neck, breathing in his musky scent, letting the tears spill. Outside the stall, Everett exhaled slowly. Relief mingled with something like reverence. Reuben cleared his throat. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "That horse really is full of surprises." As the morning light stretched across the barn's floor, Clara led Storm gently out of his stall. Together, they stepped into the soft morning sunshine. The ranch hands stopped their work, struck by the sight of this once feared creature walking calmly beside the girl whose life he had saved. Clara paused by a water trough, letting Storm dip his muzzle to drink. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if to honor the fragile new bond between them. Over the next few days, the mood at Briar Creek Ranch shifted from tension to quiet optimism. Everyone recognized that Storm had saved Clara's life, but no one quite knew what came next. The stallion, once the subject of fearful whispers, now received respectful nods from stable hands who had written him off as hopelessly dangerous. Clara's father, Everett, found himself torn between deep gratitude and an undercurrent of caution. Though Storm no longer pinned his ears and bared his teeth whenever people approached, old habits could resurface at any moment. Still, as Clara visited the horse each morning, she noticed a softening in Storm's gaze. He had become less anxious, allowing her to stroke his neck and talk to him in hushed tones. One afternoon, she even coaxed him to nibble a sugar cube from her palm, though he let out a quick snort, as if unsure about this new treat. It was a small sign of trust, but it felt monumental. Each day brought a fresh milestone, and with it a growing hope that the horse everyone feared might now begin a whole new chapter. In those early days of healing, Clara never forgot how precarious Storm's rescue had been. Sometimes, She'd close her eyes at night and see the angry torrent threatening to drag her under. Then, just as terror took hold, she'd recall the moment Storm appeared in the river, determined to save her. That memory gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. Though her father was still uneasy, he allowed Clara to spend short intervals with the horse each afternoon, so long as Reuben or another hand remained nearby. At first, Storm showed signs of restlessness around others, flattening his ears or snorting when they stepped too close. Yet he never reacted to Clara that way. By the end of the week, he even let her brush the mud-caked tangles from his mane. As she worked, Clara would hum softly, an almost lullaby-like tune that seemed to soothe them both. Each gentle stroke of the brush seemed to peel away another layer of the fear that once defined Storm. Bit by bit, horse and girl found solace in each other's presence, their bond quietly growing stronger. One morning, Everett summoned Reuben for a private talk by the barn. The two men regarded Storm in silence before stepping away from earshot. Clara, crouched near a hay bale, overheard fragments of their conversation. She caught words like liability, training, and safety. She realized her father was torn. He'd witnessed Storm's remarkable rescue, but the horse remained a risk if ever spooked. If something happened again, the ranch could face severe consequences. Clara's heart pounded as she realized they were discussing the possibility of rehoming Storm, maybe sending him elsewhere. Shaken, she slipped away before they could discover her eavesdropping. Later that day, she worked up the courage to confront her father. Eyes brimming with tears, she pleaded that Storm belonged here, that he'd already proven his worth. Everett sighed, resting a hand on his daughter's shoulder. He spoke gently about responsibility, explaining that trust must be built slowly and thoroughly, or accidents could happen. Clara listened, determined to help Storm adapt so he could stay for good. She silently vowed to protect the horse who had saved her. She refused to let him go. By week's end, Clara devised a plan. Each morning, after breakfast, she and Storm would stroll around the ranch under Everett's watchful eye. The first few outings were short. A circuit past the chicken coop, around the weathered oak tree, and back to the barn. Storm's ears flicked uneasily whenever he heard a sudden noise, like a wheelbarrow tipping or a rooster crowing. But Clara spoke to him gently, praising his every measured step. Over time, they ventured farther. One day, Clara led Storm past the cattle pens, where bellowing bulls often startled new horses. Though Storm snorted and pulled back on the lead, Clara calmed him with a soft hum. She refused to rush or yank the rope, instead waiting until his panic subsided. Gradually, Storm began to trust that she wouldn't force him into terrifying situations. Everett, observing from a distance, grudgingly approved of their progress. He still had reservations, but couldn't deny that each slow, deliberate walk boosted Storm's confidence. The ranch hands, too, warmed to the stallion, greeting him with subdued respect rather than wary scowls. A peace settled over Briar Creek Ranch. Despite these calm routines, a question tugged at Everett's conscience. Would Storm ever allow a rider? He broached the subject with Reuben, who raised a skeptical brow. Storm might tolerate Clara on the ground, Reuben cautioned, but the weight of a saddle could trigger the very aggression they'd managed to subdue. Clara, overhearing this, felt her heart skip. She longed to ride Storm someday, to gallop across open fields with the horse who had risked his life for hers. But a deeper part of her understood that pushing him too soon could destroy the trust they'd built. Even so, her curiosity about Storm's history grew. Where had he come from, and why was he so haunted? One afternoon, she mustered the courage to ask Everett. He admitted that Storm's past was... The auction papers had revealed only that he'd been taken from an out-of-state ranch that wanted a sale. Gossip hinted at a history of harsh training methods that left Storm traumatized. Clara felt a pang of sympathy. She resolved that if Storm was ever to be ridden, it would be on his own terms. As autumn approached, a chill settled over the ranch. Leaves turned golden, and the crisp morning air carried the scent of hay and wood smoke. Clara spent her weekends in Storm's paddock, teaching him to navigate simple ground poles and accept gentle pats from other ranch hands. She hoped that broadening his comfort zone would ease any lingering fears. Progress was evident. Storm no longer startled at a passing tractor or a barking dog. Yet at times, a flicker of old panic still flashed in his eyes. One afternoon, Clara led Storm to a shallow pond at the ranch's edge. She wanted to see if water still frightened him after the river ordeal. The stallion pawed at the reflective surface, uncertain. But when Clara stepped into the water herself, Storm followed, snorting softly as ripples swirled around his hooves. Relief washed over Clara, and she whispered her praise. Later that evening, Everett watched them from the hilltop. Though worry still etched his features, he couldn't deny the profound bond that had taken shape. The horse who dove into a flooded creek was learning to trust again. That same night, Clara dreamed of galloping across the ranch astride Storm. In her vision, he was free of all fear, his strong legs carrying them effortlessly over rolling hills. She woke with her heart pounding, a sense of purpose alight in her chest. The next morning, she approached Everett, asking if they could try placing a lightweight blanket on Storm's back, just to see if he'd tolerate it. Everett considered her request, then reluctantly agreed, but only if he supervised. With Reuben's help, Clara carefully introduced Storm to the blanket, letting him sniff the unfamiliar fabric. Though he sidestepped nervously at first, he did not lash out. Clara draped the blanket across his back, her hands trembling. Storm twitched but remained still, ears twitching with evident concern. Clara soothed him with gentle words, reminding him he was safe. After a few moments, she removed the blanket and offered him a slice of apple. Storm accepted it, his muscles visibly relaxing. Everett said nothing, but the relief in his eyes was clear. They had taken another tiny step forward, guided by trust that seemed to grow stronger each day. Autumn deepened across the ranch. Crisp mornings greeted Clara and Storm with a swirl of fallen leaves, and the sun sank earlier each afternoon, painting the sky in rich golds and pinks. Though the days shortened, the trust between girl and horse lengthened in quiet leaps. One mild afternoon, Clara decided to introduce Storm to a soft bridle. The memory of how he once flared his nostrils at any attempt to handle his face made her cautious, but her heart fluttered with hope. She carried the bridle with care, letting Storm sniff the leather. The moment his ears twitched in alarm, she paused, patiently reassuring him with gentle murmurs. Slowly, Storm allowed her to slide the headstall over his ears, though he stiffened when the bit neared his mouth. Reuben, standing a short distance away, braced for a frantic struggle. Yet after a few tense seconds, Storm parted his jaws just enough for Clara to ease the metal into place. The wave of relief that washed through them both was palpable. Over the ensuing days, Clara continued this exercise until Storm accepted the bridle without protest. Each step forward made her father proud, albeit quietly, for Everett was still mindful of the potential risks. One crisp morning, after a gentle round of grooming, Clara checked Storm's bandaged foreleg. The cut that had bled so fiercely on the night of her rescue had healed with surprising speed. Although a thin scar remained, the underlying muscle showed no sign of lingering injury. Glancing at Everett, who hovered on the barn's threshold, Clara asked if she might try leading Storm under saddle next. He hesitated before giving a slow nod. As Reuben fetched a lightweight training saddle, Clara recalled the first time Storm had tolerated a blanket on his back. He had trembled then, overcome by old fears. Now, something about his gaze suggested he was ready to trust a bit more. Handling the saddle, she approached him with calm precision, mindful to keep her own nerves in check. Clara let Storm see and sniff the saddle before resting it gently along his spine. Despite his earlier progress, the horse's muscles quivered under the unfamiliar pressure. She waited, giving him time to process the sensation. A tense heartbeat passed, then Storm blew a soft breath, neck relaxing slightly. Clara proceeded to fasten the girth, her fingers deft yet slow. Half expecting a sudden jolt, Reuben stood close at hand, rope coiled in case Storm panicked. But no such reaction came. Instead, the stallion shifted his weight, rolling an eye in Clara's direction as if to ask, "Is this all right?" Clara responded by stroking his neck and uttering words of praise. They walked him around the paddock, cautious and observant, ensuring each step felt secure. Throughout, Storm's ears flicked back and forth, but he never balked. By the time they completed a circuit, even Reuben exhaled with relief, momentarily forgetting his lingering doubts about the stallion's unpredictable history. As the days wore on, the ranch settled into a gentle rhythm of daily chores and purposeful training sessions. Clara devoted every spare minute to Storm, grooming him, leading him through simple ground exercises, and introducing him to various objects, rustling tarps, rattling buckets, and more, to ensure that unexpected sights and sounds would no longer send him into a panic. The more they worked, the calmer Storm became, his old wariness gradually replaced by quiet cooperation. He even tolerated having his hooves tapped and checked by the ranch's farrier, a procedure that had once risked violent outbursts. A few of the older ranch hands watched in respectful silence, remembering the early days when Storm had lunged at anyone daring enough to approach. Now they found themselves offering apples or carrots from open palms, pleasantly startled when the horse took these treats without baring his teeth. Still, no one forgot that he remained large and powerful, a creature whose instincts had been shaped by unknown hardships. One weekend, after observing Clara and Storm breeze through the paddock routine, Everett felt a surge of cautious optimism. In the weeks since Storm's heroic rescue, the horse had gone from dreaded outcast to quiet companion. Everett recognized that trust, though fragile, was blossoming in Storm's once guarded spirit. Spurred by this realization, he proposed an idea at breakfast. Perhaps Clara could try sitting on Storm's back for a moment under controlled conditions. Clara's eyes sparkled with excitement, and though her mother raised an eyebrow, she did not object. After all, Storm had proven his loyalty in the face of real peril. Still, Everett insisted on every safety measure: a proper riding helmet, a second lead rope in Reuben's hands, and a quiet section of the paddock free of distractions. Clara agreed eagerly, but as they prepared, she felt butterflies flutter in her stomach. The memory of how Storm once reacted to touch and confinement still made her heart pound. The morning sun shone on the paddock, casting long shadows of fence posts across the dusty ground. Reuben double-checked every buckle on Storm's saddle, while Marcus stood by the gate, holding a coil of rope. Clara donned her helmet, hands trembling slightly with excitement. Then, leading Storm by his bridle, she guided him into the center of the enclosure. Her father stood close, a reassuring presence. Storm swished his tail, clearly aware of the unusual tension in the air. Clara murmured softly, letting him know everything was all right. Placing her left foot in the stirrup, she paused. A hush settled over the small gathering. In one fluid motion, she swung her right leg over Storm's back, settling onto the saddle. Storm's ears angled backward, and he gave a low snort, shifting his weight as though unsure of what came next. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her body still, letting him sense no fear or haste. Slowly, Storm steadied, accepting this new reality. She sat astride him for a long moment, barely breathing, until Reuben gave the faintest nod. Clara gently nudged Storm forward, and he took a tentative step, then another. Encouraged, she clicked her tongue, coaxing him into a slow walk around the paddock. Each footfall felt deliberate, as though Storm were relearning how to move with a rider. The tension in his neck gradually ebbed. Awe and relief shimmered in Clara's eyes. From his vantage point by the fence, Everett suppressed a surge of protective caution, allowing himself a proud grin. Reuben, leading Storm with a loose rope, monitored the stallion's every twitch. But Storm remained calm. One ear turned toward Clara's voice. When they completed a full circle, the onlookers broke into murmured applause. It was more than a ride. It was a moment of redemption for a horse once deemed dangerous. Clara dismounted with care, landing on shaky legs. She hugged Storm's neck, tears pricking her eyes, whispering, "We did it." That evening, the ranch buzzed with excitement. Talk of Clara's ride spread quickly, stirring hope across the ranch. Around the dinner table, Everett acknowledged Storm's remarkable growth, yet reminded everyone to remain vigilant. After supper, Clara slipped out to the barn. Storm lifted his head, ears pricked, when she entered his stall. She approached with quiet awe, recalling how he had once leaped into a raging river to save her. Running her fingers through his mane, she whispered her thanks. In that moment, Clara understood that their bond was no accident. Fate had bound them, and together they had begun rewriting each other's stories in healing and hope. The next morning at Briar Creek Ranch dawned crisp and clear, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Clara awoke brimming with excitement, replaying the memory of her first ride on Storm. In the early light, she scrambled into her boots and dashed outside to find her father already in the barn, oiling the leather on a well-worn saddle. Nearby, Storm stood in his stall, shifting with barely contained energy. The stallion lifted his head at Clara's approach, and she felt that now familiar leap of gratitude in her chest. Only weeks ago, he'd been a creature of deep suspicion and fear. Now, it was as if they'd discovered a language known only to them. One composed of gentle touches, soft words, and unwavering faith. Everett glanced up at Clara, noting her flushed cheeks. "You seem eager, Pumpkin," he said, setting the saddle aside. In truth, he shared her sense of wonder. He had watched Storm transform from a traumatized animal into a horse capable of forming real connections. Still, caution lingered at the edges of his mind. "Want to help me check him over before you take him out?" he suggested, motioning for Clara to join him. She stepped into Storm's stall, greeting the stallion with a gentle pat on his shoulder. His dark eyes sparkled, and he let out a soft whicker as she ran her hands over his coat, carefully inspecting for any sign of soreness. Finding none, she smiled at her father. "He seems good as new," she declared. After a light grooming session, Clara led Storm into the open paddock. The sun had lifted just high enough to warm the dew that clung to the grass. She positioned the saddle with care, checking the girth twice before slipping on the bridle. Reuben ambled over, arms folded. "Ready?" he asked, though the corner of his mouth hinted at a grin. Clara nodded, pulling down on the brim of her hat. She settled a foot in the stirrup and eased herself into the seat, balancing her weight gently. She could feel Storm's muscles tense, only for an instant, before he relaxed under her. The first few steps were slow, as if both girl and horse were rediscovering a newly formed alliance. Then Reuben gave Clara a thumbs up, and she urged Storm into a confident walk around the fence line. It wasn't long before Clara guided Storm into a trot. The rhythm felt like a heart beating beneath her, each stride a reminder of how far they had come. Everett observed from a short distance, trying to mask the swell of pride in his chest. Reuben, too, stood watchful. Months ago, neither man would have believed the scene unfolding before them, a young girl and the once dangerous stallion moving together with poised unity. Clara took slow turns, letting Storm adjust to subtle rain cues, and occasionally transitioned him back to a walk to offer praise. With each pass, the stallion's confidence grew, his ears pricking forward in eager concentration. In that crisp morning air, it was as if horse and rider danced to a melody only they could hear. In the weeks that followed, Clara continued these sessions under the watchful eye of her father or Reuben. As Storm learned more refined cues, their bond seemed to deepen. When Clara dismounted each day, Storm would lower his head for her to remove his bridle without any sign of distress. Then she would slip him a treat, a carrot or a slice of apple, and linger, running her fingers through his mane. Each small routine felt like a promise. Storm would never again be treated as a disposable creature unworthy of kindness. He had found a family here, and though his scars remained, he no longer seemed haunted by them. Still, life on a ranch was never without challenges. The summer floods had damaged portions of the fencing along Briar Creek, and now that the waters had receded, Everett and the ranch hands were left with endless repairs. Horses needed daily exercise, cattle required constant monitoring, and the approach of winter meant stocking up on feed. Amid the flurry, Clara slipped in her training whenever she could. Some days, she simply took Storm for a stroll through the rolling fields, letting him graze on sweet clover as she braided the tangles in his mane. Other days, she guided him carefully around barrels, teaching him to pivot and circle without fear. She believed these gentle, varied lessons built Storm's trust in both her and the ranch itself. Instead of confining him to repetitive drills, she allowed him to explore and discover that this land, with its gentle slopes and open skies, was now his home. One late afternoon, Marcus, a stable hand who had grown fond of Storm, mentioned a small charity event being planned in town. It was a local harvest fair that often included a casual horse show. They mostly do friendly competitions, he told Clara while refilling Storm's water bucket. It's nothing big, but you could show folks what he can do. Clara's eyes lit up. She imagined leading Storm into a public arena, sharing with others the remarkable progress he had made. But the idea also filled her with nerves. How would Storm react to a crowd of strangers, to music, clapping, and bright banners? She'd never exposed him to anything that chaotic. She broached the subject with Everett, who looked thoughtful. If you think he's ready, maybe a small fair would be a good test, he said, but we have to be very careful. One spook could set him back. Clara understood. She didn't want to overwhelm Storm or risk undoing all the trust they had built. Reuben chimed in that perhaps a calm demonstration, something simple, would suffice, rather than a true competition. Over the following days, they gradually introduced Storm to louder noises and new sights. Colorful flags fluttering in the wind, a portable speaker that played music, even a handful of chairs set up near the paddock to mimic a small audience. The first time she turned on the speaker, Storm snorted and sidestepped, but Clara quickly reassured him, turning the volume down. By the third practice, he stood quietly, flicking only an occasional ear at the strange noise. With each session, Clara's confidence in Storm grew. She could see in his eyes a willingness to face discomfort if she was beside him. The day of the harvest fair arrived beneath clear autumn skies. The early sun glowed with the promise of warm breezes, and Clara felt a flutter of anticipation as she prepped Storm's tack. She wiped every buckle until it gleamed and brushed Storm until his coat shone like polished mahogany. Her mother insisted on braiding his mane for a neater appearance. Storm allowed the fussing without protest, though he kept turning to nose Clara's pockets in search of an apple. When it was time to load him onto the trailer, Storm hesitated at the threshold, perhaps recalling unpleasant journeys from his past. But Clara whispered encouragement, and he finally stepped inside, trusting her enough to do what he might once have feared. By midday, they arrived at the fairgrounds, a wide swath of grass on the outskirts of town. Booths lined the perimeter, where local farmers displayed fresh produce, and children squealed at the sight of tethered ponies offering short rides. Clara walked Storm around the edges first, letting him study the swirling colors and bustling crowds from a safe distance. He tensed whenever laughter or applause erupted, but she stroked his neck, speaking calmly. Sure enough, Storm's gaze turned curious rather than panicked. Everett and Reuben followed close behind, prepared to intervene if Storm showed any real sign of distress. When it came time for their demonstration, Clara guided Storm into a makeshift ring set up in the center of the fairgrounds. A scattering of onlookers gathered, some with cotton candy in hand, others holding cameras. Children perched on hay bales, eyes sparkling with excitement. Clara felt her heart pound. She breathed deeply, remembering how sure Storm's feet had felt beneath her at the ranch. Sliding her boot into the stirrup, she mounted him in a single fluid motion. A hush of anticipation fell. Storm's ears flicked nervously at the applause that greeted them, but Clara nudged him gently forward, and he relaxed once he recognized her voice. Clara began with a simple walk, then guided Storm into a smooth trot. The crowd broke into smiles and scattered claps, impressed by how calm the stallion seemed amid the commotion. Clara led him through a set of small obstacles, colorful cones, a low wooden plank to walk over, and a fluttering banner that she waved from the saddle. Though Storm snorted at the banner's erratic motion, he did not shy away. By the time she brought him to a halt in the middle of the ring, cheers erupted from the crowd. Clara could hardly contain her grin. The demonstration might have seemed modest to seasoned riders, but for this horse who had once been cast aside as unrideable and vicious, it was nothing short of a triumph. After dismounting, Clara stroked Storm's neck, praising him in a trembling whisper. That was when a group of curious bystanders approached the ring, eager to meet the horse who had stolen the show. One older gentleman with a worn cowboy hat doffed it politely, saying he couldn't believe a horse of such presence had come from a local ranch. Another woman, holding the hand of a wide-eyed child, asked if the rumors were true. Had this same stallion really saved a girl from drowning? Before Clara could answer, Everett and Reuben stepped forward to help recount Storm's incredible story. The child gazed at Storm in astonishment, eventually mustering the courage to reach out and pat his shoulder. Storm stood motionless, quiet and poised, allowing the gentle contact. Clara's eyes misted as she realized just how far Storm had come. From a terrified and hostile beast to a creature offering comfort and wonder to curious strangers. Throughout the afternoon, more people drifted by to ask about the bay stallion with the brave heart. Reuben grinned from ear to ear, retelling the rescue tale with dramatic flair. Everett, for his part, displayed pride tempered by humility. He knew that Storm's turnaround was still a fragile gift. As for Clara, she felt a deep surge of gratitude. She recalled how Storm had once leaped unprompted into a raging river to save her life. Now, in front of the fair's audience, she returned the favor in a gentler way, showing him that not every gathering was a threat, and that applause could be welcoming rather than frightening. By the time they left the fairgrounds at sunset, Storm had experienced a glimpse of a world that no longer wished him harm. Driving back to the ranch, Clara leaned her head against the truck's window, watching the silhouette of the trailer behind them. The memory of the day's cheers and laughter warmed her chest. Tomorrow, she would let Storm wander his paddock, unhurried and content. But tonight, she held the spark of possibility close to her heart. When Clara awoke the next morning, a quiet excitement still lingered from the day before. She dressed quickly and slipped outside, expecting to find the ranch in its usual early morning bustle. Instead, she discovered her father standing by the pasture fence, studying Storm with a curious intensity. The stallion stood in the far corner, drinking in the dawn light. A stray breeze ruffled his mane, and Clara couldn't help but admire the transformation that had taken place in such a short time. Even from this distance, she could sense his calm. She approached Everett, who gave her a thoughtful nod before speaking. "He did well yesterday," Everett said. "You both did. I've never seen a horse handle that kind of crowd so soon after." He trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. Clara understood. Storm's leap from a feared outcast to a small-town marvel still astonished them all. While they watched Storm meander closer, Clara reflected on the fair's aftermath. The small demonstration had been a success, so much so that a handful of spectators had approached afterward, praising Storm's composure and asking if Clara had any plans to show him again. Even Reuben, who tended toward caution, admitted he felt a new respect for the stallion. Clara looked up at her father, a silent question forming in her eyes. "Do you think we should keep practicing away from the ranch? Maybe let Storm see more places?" she asked, trying to sound casual. She half feared he might say they should slow down. But Everett considered her words and nodded, though with a measured expression. "It's a big step, exposing him to strange environments," he said. "But if we do it gradually, with the same patience you've shown here, I think it could help him even more." Encouraged, Clara spent the next week planning. She and Storm maintained their usual training routine at Briar Creek Ranch, working on transitions, practicing halts and weaving around barrels. Whenever she could, she introduced small changes: the flap of a plastic bag, the rattle of a metal pail, the sudden clang of a gate. Storm flinched at some noises, but over time he began to relax more quickly. She praised him lavishly each time he settled without bolting. In the evenings, she pored over horse magazines and borrowed books from the local library, soaking up tips on building confidence and trust. Though Storm had already proven his courage, she sensed that there remained pieces of his past still lurking in the shadows. She told herself that every ounce of gentleness today would stand guard against the ghosts of yesterday. Finally, Clara convinced Everett to let them trail a Storm to a neighboring property a few miles down the road. The Armstrongs owned a large, open field often used for local gatherings, and Mr. Armstrong had kindly offered it for Storm's next outing. Early one Saturday, Clara led Storm into the trailer. He hesitated at the ramp, ears flicking back, but with a soft word from Clara, he stepped aboard. The drive was short, yet Storm emerged with sweat-darkened patches on his neck, signs of underlying anxiety. Clara's heart clenched at the sight. She walked him around the empty field, letting him sniff the tall grass and the old wooden fence that outlined the perimeter. Though the place was silent, Storm's eyes darted with every shift of the breeze. "Easy, boy," she murmured, rubbing his shoulder in a steady circle. Soon enough, his breathing steadied, and the trembling in his flank eased. They spent the morning there, doing little more than walking, trotting, and exploring the new surroundings. Clara's mother, who had driven separately, arrived with sandwiches at lunchtime. Sitting on a blanket, they watched Storm graze while Everett hovered protectively. "Is he calm enough?" Clara's mother asked, concern knitting her brow. "He seems on edge." Clara shrugged gently, feeding her mother the best reassurance she could. "He's anxious, but he's handling it. A few weeks ago, he would have been pacing and trying to yank away from me. This is progress." Indeed, the difference was striking. Storm's anxiety didn't evaporate, but it no longer morphed into outright panic or aggression. He always looked back to Clara as though ensuring she was near, and that seemed to anchor him. The rest of the afternoon passed in a peaceful rhythm. Clara practiced mounting Storm in the new field, guiding him in gentle circles while Everett and her mother looked on. Periodically, Reuben would wave a tarp in the distance or drag an old feed sack across the grass, simulating random distractions Storm might face elsewhere. Though the stallion tossed his head at the noise, he didn't shy away or bolt. With each small success, Clara's confidence soared, and she sensed Storm's trust solidifying like the roots of a sturdy tree. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they loaded Storm back into the trailer for the ride home. This time, he stepped up the ramp without nearly as much hesitation, though he snorted as the door latched behind him. That night, as the ranch settled into twilight, Clara found herself thinking about a conversation she'd overheard months ago between her father and Reuben. They'd questioned whether Storm could ever be truly safe. Now she realized that safety wasn't a simple yes or no. Everyone, horse or human, carried scars that might flare under the right stress. But Storm had proven that he wasn't doomed to remain trapped by his fears. As she made her way to his stall, she caught a glimpse of his dark silhouette. He was standing calmly, ears twitching as she approached. She opened the door and slipped inside, letting the lantern light dance across the hay. Storm turned his head and pressed his soft muzzle against her arm, a silent greeting that spoke volumes. Clara traced the outline of the old scar along his shoulder and whispered, "You're no monster, you never were. We're gonna show everyone how amazing you are." Beneath her fingertips, she felt the stallion's muscles relax, and in his warm exhale, she found the quiet assurance that her words were not in vain. A few days later, early morning chores led Clara through the fields. She paused by the creek where she had nearly drowned. The memory still made her stomach flutter. Leaning against a rough cedar tree, she recalled that horrifying moment when the muddy current pulled her under. Then she remembered the flash of Storm's body plunging in, his mane tangling in her grip. A wave of gratitude surged through her. She realized that Storm had, in many ways, saved more than her life that night. He had given her a purpose. She was determined to help him reclaim every ounce of confidence he had once been denied. As if in response to her unspoken resolve, new opportunities began to surface. Word of their demonstration at the fair had spread, and they received an invitation to a nearby equestrian center for a fun weekend showcase. It wasn't a high-stakes competition, mostly local riders gathering to practice jumps and give brief performances, but the environment would be livelier than the small fair. Everett was hesitant at first, worried that Storm might become overwhelmed. But after seeing how calmly he handled the Armstrongs' field, Everett relented. "We'll take every precaution," he insisted. "But I admit, I'd like to see what he can do in a real arena." On the morning of the showcase, Clara woke before dawn, excitement and nerves tangling in her belly. She tiptoed to the barn where she found Storm awake, as if sensing her anticipation. His ears pricked forward when she entered, and he let out a soft nicker. Smiling, Clara went about brushing him until his coat shone. She carefully wrapped his legs for travel, remembering the scrape he once got on the trailer's metal edge. After breakfast, Everett and Reuben helped load Storm. This time, the stallion gave only a slight pause before stepping inside, calmer than he'd ever been for transport. Clara rewarded him with a soft pat and a murmured, "Good boy." They arrived at the equestrian center under skies of pale blue. The place hummed with activity, horses of various breeds being led around, the ring freshly raked, bright flags rippling in the breeze. Clara led Storm out of the trailer slowly, letting him adjust to the new sights and sounds. Several other riders offered friendly hellos. Some recognized Storm from the fair, remarking on how well he seemed to behave despite his past reputation. Clara felt a surge of pride when Storm allowed strangers to pass by, his tail flicking with only mild irritation. Their turn in the ring came shortly after lunch. A modest audience gathered in the bleachers, chatting and sipping drinks. A few children pressed their faces against the fence to watch. Clara mounted Storm with practiced care. She could feel the tension in his muscles, but he didn't shy away. Guiding him onto the sandy footing, she began with a walk, just as she had at the fair. Storm's ears flicked nervously at the scattered applause, but Clara steadied him with her seat and voice. They moved into a fluid trot, circling the arena, weaving around cones. The ring was bigger than the field they'd practiced in, yet Storm adjusted quickly, as if seeking reassurance in the familiar patterns. Near the arena's center stood a low jump, only a couple of small rails set maybe a foot off the ground, perfect for new or timid horses. Clara hadn't pushed Storm to jump much, but they had practiced stepping over ground poles back at the ranch. Sensing an opportunity to show his versatility, she steered Storm toward it. His ears shot forward, and for a moment, Clara felt the surge of his curiosity. With a steady hand, she offered a gentle squeeze of her legs. Storm gathered his stride, hopped lightly over the rails, and landed without a stumble. The crowd let out a collective cheer, and Clara nearly laughed from pure relief. They circled back and tried it again, this time at a slightly faster trot. Storm's jump was effortless, the arc of his body revealing a glimmer of the potential he once might have had under different circumstances. When Clara finally halted him in front of the audience, the applause was warm and sincere. Storm's head bobbed, his nostrils flaring to draw in the new sense of the cheering crowd, but he displayed no sign of panic. Over the fence, Everett stood with his arms folded, a broad smile creasing his weathered face. Reuben, too, wore a look of genuine admiration. As Clara dismounted, the ring assistant approached with an outstretched hand. "He's beautiful," the assistant said, offering Storm a pat on the neck. "And so well behaved. You'd never guess he had a difficult past." After a final wave to the crowd, Clara led Storm out of the ring. Her heart thudded with excitement and a deep satisfaction. Passing a group of riders, she overheard snippets of praise, something about how Storm looked confident and poised. It struck her that the horse once dismissed as vicious was now earning compliments from people who had never known his darkest days. She pressed her forehead briefly against Storm's, her breath catching as she whispered, "Look at you, brave boy. Look at what you've done." Storm let out a low nicker, as if to say he understood. In that moment, Clara felt the warmth of possibility swelling within her. If Storm could conquer the ghosts of his past, there might be no limit to what he could achieve in the future. Early the next morning, Clara walked Storm around the paddock in a celebratory calm. Their day at the equestrian center had been a resounding success, and in the quiet hush of dawn, she could still feel the echoes of the applause and kind words. Storm's hooves made soft thuds against the dewy earth, and Clara murmured gentle praises, reveling in how far they'd come. She felt certain there was more to uncover, a deeper potential within Storm that neither she nor anyone else had fully tapped. Everett emerged from the barn with a steaming mug in hand. From where she stood, Clara could see pride in his eyes, the kind of pride that softened the lines on his face. As Storm halted near the gate, Everett approached slowly, resting a hand on the stallion's shoulder. "You did us all proud," he said, voice hushed. Storm gave a low whicker that carried no trace of the fear he once displayed. Clara couldn't help smiling. Moments like these, shared in the subtle glow of sunrise, reminded her how trust could mend what once seemed hopelessly broken. For the remainder of the week, the ranch settled into a peaceful routine. Clara and Storm worked on refining the basics, smoother transitions, sharper turns, and a few small jumps. The memory of how elegantly Storm had cleared the low rails at the equestrian center lingered in Clara's mind, inspiring her to raise the bar, literally just a little at a time. Each success fueled her conviction that, given patience, Storm could excel in ways no one had thought possible. Even Reuben, the eternal skeptic, seemed impressed, occasionally offering pointers about timing and rain cues. One afternoon, as Clara groomed Storm outside the barn, Marcus ambled over carrying a folded newspaper. He tapped the front page with a bemused smile. "You two made the local paper," he announced, handing it to Clara. Sure enough, an article praised the strong turnout at the weekend showcase, mentioning a remarkable stallion named Storm, guided by a young rider who has earned his devotion. A grainy photo showed Clara mid-trot, Storm's mane billowing like dark silk. Clara's cheeks warmed at the unexpected publicity. She offered Storm a pat, leaning into his shoulder. "I guess people are starting to believe in you," she murmured. News of Storm's progress reached beyond the ranch and the small-town crowd. One evening, Everett sat at the kitchen table, reading a letter with a furrowed brow. Clara, finishing her homework, glanced up to see him shaking his head in faint disbelief. "What is it?" she asked. He cleared his throat, handing her the page. It was an invitation to a reputable regional riding club's upcoming event, an autumn exhibition that attracted more experienced riders from neighboring counties. They'd heard rumors of Storm's dramatic turnaround and wanted to see the pair in action. Clara's heart fluttered. The invitation felt like both an honor and a challenge. She looked at her father, a silent question in her eyes. Everett set the letter aside, exhaling slowly. "It's bigger than anything you've done so far," he cautioned. "There'll be more people, more noise. It could overwhelm him." Clara nodded in understanding, but she couldn't hide her excitement. "We'll be careful, Dad," she promised. "We won't attempt anything beyond what we know he can handle, but how else will he keep growing?" After a long pause, Everett smiled in resignation. "All right," he said. "We'll give it a shot if we can prepare him properly." From that moment on, Clara and Storm intensified their training. Reuben rigged up new obstacles in the practice arena, rows of visually distracting objects meant to simulate the bustle of a large crowd. Marcus found an old speaker system, which they used to play recorded applause and announcements. The first time the artificial clamor filled the paddock, Storm tensed, sidestepping toward Clara as if seeking comfort. She patted his neck, allowing him time to absorb the unfamiliar noise. They repeated the exercise each day, turning the volume slightly higher until Storm barely flicked an ear at the sound of cheering voices. On weekends, Everett arranged short outings to places with moderate foot traffic, a local park, a friend's ranch, even a small orchard that offered public tours. Clara never rode Storm in these spaces unannounced, but she walked him on a lead line, letting him see random faces and hear new sounds. Whenever he stiffened, she stood beside him, giving a soft hum. Over time, Storm's moments of hesitation shrank. He began to display genuine curiosity, lowering his nose to sniff a stroller or listening intently when children giggled nearby. Each discovery seemed to melt another layer of his old wariness. As the date of the regional exhibition drew near, Clara felt a buzz of nerves. She'd listened to experienced riders describe the event, horses prancing in polished tack, large bleachers full of onlookers, and seasoned trainers evaluating every movement. The night before they were set to leave, she could hardly sleep. She wandered outside, needing fresh air, and found Storm awake in the dim glow of the barn lantern. Sensing her restlessness, He pressed his muzzle against her shoulder. She traced a hand down his neck, recalling the first time she'd ever touched him, how he'd nearly flinched away. Now, he stood there willingly, emanating a calm that steadied her. "Ready for tomorrow," she whispered. Though Storm couldn't answer, Clara took comfort in his steady breathing and warm presence. They departed at daybreak, the trailer rattling softly along the winding roads. Autumn leaves, crimson and gold, tumbled across the pavement, giving way to an expansive landscape that hinted at the region's grander pastures and training facilities. By mid-morning, they arrived at the venue. It was larger than anything Clara had seen, multiple arenas ringed by white fences, tall flags snapping in the breeze, and rows of trailers parked side by side. Everett parked in a quieter corner, hoping to grant Storm a gentler acclimation. As they unloaded him, Clara felt the weight of countless eyes, other riders scanning the new arrival, some with polite curiosity, others with open skepticism. Walking Storm around the perimeter, Clara let him see each corner of the grounds. He shifted uneasily at the flurry of movement, from horses cantering in a warm-up ring to riders chatting near concession stands. But he kept pace beside her, ears swiveling. After a few circuits, his tension subsided. Reuben, who had traveled with them, set out a stool so Clara could tack up Storm. He fidgeted once or twice as an unfamiliar horse trotted by, but her calm chatter eased him back to composure. Soon enough, she finished adjusting the saddle, and Everett checked every strap before allowing her to mount. Clara guided Storm toward the assigned arena for their demonstration slot. A modest crowd sat in the bleachers, scanning the schedule, sipping warm drinks against the autumn chill. Her chest clenched with anticipation. She knew this demonstration meant more than just a ride. This was Storm's chance to prove he could hold his own among seasoned competitors. The arena buzzed with music piped through loudspeakers, and an announcer's voice echoed across the grounds. Storm started at the amplified voice, but Clara gave a soft command, and he steadied. Their turn began with a gentle walk around the ring. Clara focused on breathing evenly, keeping her hands relaxed. The watchers took note of Storm's sleek form, the faint scars on his coat, and the distinct aura of a horse still learning to trust. Then she urged him into a trot. He complied smoothly, hooves drumming a steady rhythm across the footing. Applause drifted in from the stands, mingling with the distant calls of other riders. Clara steered Storm through a series of arcs and serpentines, demonstrating his responsiveness to her rein and leg cues. Despite a few uncertain flicks of his ears, Storm performed beautifully, never once bracing or trying to evade. Encouraged, Clara approached the small jump, a modest crossrail set near the middle of the course. Storm's ears pricked forward, and his body tensed. She spoke softly, giving a gentle squeeze. He launched over the crossrail, landing neatly on the other side with only a minor scramble of hooves. A spatter of clapping followed. Clara grinned, feeling pride well up inside her like a bright, expanding balloon. She angled him around for a second pass, this time with a cleaner approach. Storm soared again, clearing the rail by a comfortable margin. The applause grew louder. Emboldened, Clara guided him into a final circle, concluding the demonstration with a graceful halt at the center of the arena. When they exited the ring, Everett was waiting with Reuben, both wearing broad smiles. Reuben clapped Clara lightly on the back, while Everett ran a hand along Storm's neck. "You two keep surprising me," Everett said, voice quivering with emotion he rarely displayed. Storm lifted his head, eyeing the spectators who passed. Though still wary, he no longer radiated the raw panic of old. Clara slid out of the saddle, patting him. "You were incredible," she whispered, pressing her cheek to his neck. In that moment, the swirl of new faces and foreign noises felt secondary to the sheer wonder of Storm's transformation. Their success did not go unnoticed. A few riders approached, commending Clara on her patient training. One tall woman in a sleek riding jacket admitted she'd heard rumors of a savage horse-turned-hero, but hadn't quite believed them. "He has real promise," she remarked, nodding at Storm, "especially for jumping. If you ever decide to compete more seriously, I'd be curious to see how far he can go." Clara felt her cheeks flush. The idea of turning Storm into a genuine competitor had crossed her mind before, but she'd never allowed herself to dwell on it. Above all else, she wanted him safe and happy. Yet a small seed of ambition took root in her heart at the rider's words. Maybe in time, Storm could become more than anyone had imagined, even beyond the realm of these friendly demonstrations. As the afternoon wore on, they strolled the grounds, letting Storm graze by a patch of grass away from the bustle. Clara leaned against the fence, arms draped over the top rail. She thought of the girl she'd been a few seasons ago, nearly swept away in floodwaters. She thought of Storm, thrashing in that same river to save her, forging a bond that neither of them had anticipated. Now, the world felt vast with possibility, as though every corner of the horizon held a new chance for them both. Watching Storm munch quietly, she smiled, content to see him so at ease. The future seemed bright, and for once, Storm's scars no longer defined him. They were simply part of the journey that led them here. After their successful day at the regional exhibition, Clara and Storm returned to Briar Creek Ranch with a renewed sense of purpose. In the weeks that followed, Clara invested every spare moment into their training. The crisp autumn air carried the promise of winter, and she knew that soon the weather might limit their outdoor practice. Still, nothing could dampen her excitement. Each time she walked Storm around the paddock at sunrise, she marveled at how his ears would flick at familiar ranch sounds, cattle lowing, roosters crowing, yet he no longer startled or tensed. He had, in her mind, claimed this land as home. They repeated ground exercises, refining transitions and testing his boundaries with new obstacles. She practiced longer sessions of trotting and cantering beneath the wide sky, coaxing Storm to stretch his stride just a little more with each ride. In those joyful hours, the only thing that mattered was the trusting bond between them. One frosty morning, while Clara was mucking Storm's stall, Marcus entered the barn, holding a letter in his gloved hand. "This came for you," he said, passing the envelope to Clara. She glanced at the official crest on the corner, an emblem of crossed riding crops encircled by laurel leaves. Inside, she discovered an invitation to a more advanced competition, hosted by a well-respected equestrian association known for attracting both rising amateurs and seasoned professionals. Apparently, word of Storm's dramatic backstory and promising performance had traveled far. Clara's stomach fluttered with a mix of nerves and excitement. She showed the letter to Everett that evening. Though her father's brow creased, he nodded thoughtfully when he read it. "This is a bigger stage," he told her, setting the paper down. "We have to be certain he's ready. If he spooks in front of a large, demanding crowd..." He trailed off, but Clara understood. One misstep could unravel months of progress. Undeterred, Clara resolved to step up their training. Reuben helped by constructing a small course in the ranch's practice arena, complete with higher rails and more visually distracting props, vibrant flags, painted barrels, and shiny foil streamers. When Storm first caught sight of the fluttering streamers, he balked, tossing his head and taking a few uncertain steps backward. Clara dismounted, leading him close enough to inspect each shimmering strand, letting him realize there was no danger. Over several sessions, Storm's nerves settled, and he began trotting past the reflective decorations with only mild curiosity. Each victory felt like another building block, stacking upon the solid foundation they had created since his rescue. Despite the progress, Clara noticed that Storm occasionally fell into bouts of moodiness. At times, while grooming him, she sensed a flicker of the old tension near his eyes, as though something from his past still lingered. Once, late in the afternoon, she was tightening his girth when a sharp snap from behind startled him. He pinned his ears flat and sidestepped, nostrils flared. Clara caught the whites of his eyes, that old panic rising to the surface. Quickly, she dropped the girth and stepped away, keeping her voice soft. Storm trembled for a few breaths before recognition returned. He exhaled a loud snort, nearly deflating with relief. Moments like that reminded Clara that healing wasn't a straight line. Sometimes old fears crept back, demanding renewed patience. She gently resumed saddling him, and soon enough, Storm stood composed again. But the incident weighed on her mind. No matter how far they had come, Storm was still fragile at his core. One morning, as they trotted loops around the paddock, Everett strode up, signaling Clara to slow. "We have another invitation," he announced, passing her a crisp flyer. "It's a winter-themed gala, 2 counties over, for charitable fundraising. They plan to feature demonstration rides from promising young horses. And they're hoping you'll bring Storm." The mention of winter raised practical concerns, traveling in uncertain weather, the risk of ice or snow. But Clara could see the spark in her father's eyes. This event was known to draw larger audiences and a swirl of media coverage. If Storm performed well, it could cement his place among reputable circles, showing that second chances were real for a horse with a troubled history. "Think he's ready for something like that?" Everett asked, glancing meaningfully at Storm's twitching ears. Clara hesitated, recalling that flash of fear in Storm's eyes when the girth had startled him. "We'll prepare thoroughly," she said, determined to be cautious yet hopeful. From then on, it felt as though the ranch itself braced for a new frontier. Days shortened, and the morning grass shimmered with frost. Clara spent hours ensuring Storm grew comfortable with thicker saddle pads and various winter gear, heavier blankets, ear bonnets to keep out the chill, even a set of reflective straps for days with dull light. Everett and Reuben helped to replicate the sounds of a busier, more frantic environment. They simulated the clamor of a busy show barn by clanging metal buckets, playing recorded announcements at a higher volume, and introducing Storm to more abrupt startles. Though he still spooked now and then, rearing slightly or sidestepping with a panicked snort, he recovered faster each time, guided by Clara's unwavering reassurance. One afternoon, Henry Parker, a local trainer known for his stern critiques, paid an unexpected visit. He had heard rumors of Storm's talents and wanted to see them firsthand. Clara invited him to watch a training session, though her stomach clenched with nerves. As Henry leaned against the fence with his arms crossed, Clara guided Storm through an elevated jump combination, 2 jumps back to back, each about 2 feet high. She felt Storm tense as they approached, but the moment they soared over the rails, his body relaxed into a smooth arc. Henry nodded impassively, then waved for her to come over. He inspected Storm's conformation and legs, rubbing his chin. "He's got decent form," he remarked. "If he's as calm as you say in new places, you might have a contender on your hands. Just watch that hind end, he doesn't overjump. But if he panics, he could clip a rail." The words were practical, not unkind. Clara breathed a quiet sigh of relief. Receiving even slight approval from Henry Parker was a commendation in itself. Encouraged, Clara kept working to refine Storm's form. She paid close attention to his approach and landing, ensuring he lifted evenly and avoided knocking the rails. More than once, he bumped them with a rear hoof, resulting in a loud clatter that made him lurch. But with each repetition, his confidence grew. Clara found a rhythm with him, counting strides, adjusting pace, and guiding him gently between each fence. Their harmony reminded her of music, each jump a note in a developing composition. Off to the side, Henry scribbled in a notebook, occasionally offering clipped feedback. Even Reuben admitted the stallion's leaps looked effortless on his best days. Amid the exhilaration, Clara never forgot the fundamental importance of quiet time. Some evenings, she wouldn't even ride Storm. Instead, she would walk beside him down a grassy lane that led toward the creek, letting him sniff at branches or watch distant cows graze. The hush of dusk settled over them like a shared secret. Once, the soft babble of water drew Clara closer to the creek's bank, the very spot where she'd nearly lost her life. She placed her hand against Storm's neck, recalling the exact moment he plunged in to save her. A rush of gratitude welled inside her, mingled with awe that a horse many had dismissed as dangerous would sacrifice himself in a heartbeat for her. In the fading light, Storm appeared regal against the violet sky, as though he carried the proud lineage of countless generations. For Clara, that single memory of his courage was a guiding star, reminding her of the goodness at the heart of every living creature when given the chance to be seen. At last, the day of the winter-themed gala arrived. By then, early snows had dusted the ranch, leaving a light coating of white across the paddocks. Clara loaded Storm into the trailer early, tucking him into a thick blanket. Though his breath billowed in frosty plumes, he stepped onto the trailer ramp with minimal coaxing, an immediate sign that he was far calmer than he'd once been. The drive took them past rolling hills draped in snow and through winding roads that glinted in the pale morning sun. Everett handled the truck with painstaking care, mindful of slippery patches. The gala was set in a grand indoor arena that shimmered with holiday decorations and strings of lights. Outside, barns lined the property, each with fresh straw and heated water troughs. It was, in many respects, the most polished venue Clara had seen, brimming with elegantly dressed riders leading immaculately groomed horses. As they parked and began unloading, Clara felt Storm stiffen at the unfamiliar scents. Wafts of cinnamon from a vendor's stall, perfume from passing spectators, the pungent smell of antiseptics drifting from a veterinary station. His ears flicked back and forth, and for an instant, she feared he might bolt. But then she placed a hand over his broad shoulder, letting him feel her calm. Gradually, his head lowered, muzzle quivering as he breathed in the frosty air. She led him away from the busy driveway, circling behind the arena where fewer people gathered. There, she stood quietly, allowing Storm to ground himself in her presence. Their scheduled demonstration was slated for mid-afternoon. In the hours prior, Clara walked Storm through the warm-up ring. It bustled with riders schooling their horses, some trotting large circles, others taking short canter spurts. Decorative wreaths and twinkling lights hung around the perimeter, creating a festive but potentially startling ambience. Storm tossed his head at the shimmering ornaments, but Clara kept a soothing hand on the reins, offering words of encouragement. With each passing minute, he seemed to adapt. By the time the announcer's voice beckoned them to the main arena, his stride had smoothed to an even tempo. Moments later, they entered under the glow of bright overhead lights. Rows of spectators lined the stands, their conversations echoing against the vaulted ceiling. The winter decorations made everything sparkle, silver tinsel draped along railings, snowflake cutouts hanging overhead. Clara felt a surge of nerves, but also of pride. Beside the entrance, Everett and Reuben stood, quietly rooting for her and Storm. She took a steadying breath, guiding him to the center for their opening salute. Applause reverberated. Storm's ears twitched, but his body remained steady beneath her. They began a simple pattern: walking, trotting, then a collected canter. Clara planned to show the audience how far Storm had come by riding him through a few gentle figures and demonstrating his responsiveness. He complied with near-flawless transitions, gliding through changes of direction with a grace that felt almost surreal. The hush in the arena turned to murmurs of admiration as Storm's dark coat shone under the lights. When Clara finally asked for a short jump, the rails shimmering with faux icicles, Storm rose to the occasion, clearing them with fluid ease. A swell of applause erupted, joined by scattered cheers and camera flashes. Through it all, Clara felt a wondrous sense of unity between herself and Storm, as if the entire crowd disappeared and only they remained, forging a bond that transcended the hardships of his past. When they finished, Clara halted in the spotlight. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent, as though waiting for Storm's reaction. The stallion stood tall, ears forward, gazing at the watchers without fear. Then the crowd erupted again, louder this time, a triumphant wave of applause that seemed to wrap around them both. Clara bowed her head in gratitude, patting Storm's neck. He'd done more than perform a routine. He had offered proof that no creature is beyond redemption. Looking out at the lights and the cheering faces, Clara realized that Storm's story had become bigger than just the two of them. He was a symbol of second chances, a living testament to the power of kindness and belief. Moments after their triumphant exit from the winter-themed gala's arena, Clara led Storm toward a quieter section of the warm-up ring, her heart still pounding from the cheers that had rained down upon them. She draped a fleecy blanket over Storm's withers, mindful of the evening chill creeping into the building. Though Storm's side still heaved from exertion, he radiated a composed energy that contrasted with the high-strung tension of the other horses cantering around. Everett and Reuben hurried over, both wearing broad smiles. "You two were incredible," Everett said, running a hand down Storm's neck. Reuben nodded in agreement, words failing him for once, his proud grin speaking volumes. Clara managed a shaky laugh, relief mingling with the last of her performance jitters. "He kept his cool better than I ever hoped," she murmured. "I'm so proud of him." Storm snorted softly, tossing his head as if acknowledging the praise. Clara's gaze flicked to the stands, where clusters of spectators still lingered, some pointing and whispering about the pair. She hadn't anticipated the rush of gratitude and wonder now filling her chest. Perhaps the success in that spotlight was not only Storm's redemption, but also a sign that they both had more to give than anyone realized. The gala's schedule rolled onward, and the ring soon filled with a dazzling display of dressage routines, fancy costumes, and a holiday-themed riding quadrille. Everett steered Clara to a set of benches so they could watch while Storm cooled down. Cloaked in his warm blanket, the stallion stood quietly, occasionally stamping a hoof at passing commotion. Clara glanced around, taking in the swirling backdrop of twinkling lights and the hum of excited chatter. Her mind drifted back to the horse auctions she had once attended, where tense bidding wars and jaded onlookers framed horses as mere commodities. How different this atmosphere was. Here, Storm was celebrated, admired even, for his spirit and skill. If only every misunderstood horse could experience such a turnaround. Lost in thought, she stroked Storm's neck, recalling how close she had come to never knowing the depth of his courage. She felt a shiver of humility, reflecting on how many others had written him off without a second glance. Before they left, a show official approached, dressed in a festive scarf and holding a clipboard. "Miss Martinez?" she asked, smiling broadly. Clara stood, noticing the official's wide-eyed admiration of Storm. "We wanted to say thank you for bringing such a unique story to our event," the woman continued. "The audience loved him. If you plan to compete more formally next season, we'd be happy to see you both again." Clara's cheeks warmed, and she murmured her gratitude. Competitions had always seemed a distant dream, more about prestige than genuine connection, yet hearing an invitation from someone so seasoned awakened a new possibility. Everett, overhearing, rested a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. "Something to think about," he said. "No rush, but you've got options." Clara nodded, a spark igniting in her mind. Did Storm have the potential to succeed at real competitions? Jumps higher, demands stricter, crowds larger? Her heart fluttered at the thought. That evening, they navigated wintry roads back to Briar Creek Ranch, arriving well after darkness fell. Steam curled in ghostly wisps from Storm's nostrils when he stepped off the trailer. Tired but content, he ambled without protest toward his stall, the chilly air amplifying the comforting scent of hay. Clara removed his blanket and tack with gentle hands, humming quietly as she checked him over for any swelling or soreness. He appeared fit, only sporting the usual post-ride fatigue. Everett watched from the barn door, arms crossed loosely. "Go get some rest," he urged Clara. "I'll handle the last of the chores." She nodded, her eyelids heavy but her spirit buzzing. As she left, she glanced back to see Storm watching her, ears tilted forward. In the lantern's glow, his dark eyes held the contentment of a horse who finally knew he belonged. Winter descended in earnest over the next few weeks, blanketing the ranch in a soft hush. The creek froze at the edges, and patches of snow gleamed under pale morning light. Training grew more challenging in the cold, forcing Clara to carefully pick times when the footing wouldn't be icy. Sometimes she simply lunged Storm inside the barn aisle or walked him around the perimeter of the stables, using the time to reinforce basic cues. Other days, when the sun cooperated, she rode him in slow, deliberate circuits of the paddock, both of them bundled against the chill. Despite the lack of big events, their bond grew stronger. Storm settled into a routine that included quiet grooming sessions, short rides, and playful moments when Clara encouraged him to trot across untouched snow. The gentle crunch under his hooves seemed to fascinate him, and Clara found joy in his curiosity. The local community, however, had not forgotten Storm's feats. Visitors from town dropped by with treats, praising the horse's heroic rescue and inquiring about future shows. Clara handled the attention with a mixture of pride and protective caution. She feared that too much fuss might overwhelm Storm or feed unrealistic expectations. One Sunday afternoon, a reporter asked if she could write a longer profile on Storm's life story. Clara hesitated, conscious of how the horse's traumatic past still shaped him, but eventually agreed, hoping to shine a light on neglected or misunderstood animals. The resulting article, published in a regional magazine, told of the flood rescue and Storm's subsequent rehabilitation. It applauded Clara's patience and Everett's guidance, painting a picture of a once wild stallion turned symbol of hope. While Clara appreciated the positive reception, a small voice warned her that not all attention was benevolent. Somewhere, she reasoned, might lurk individuals who still viewed Storm through a profit-driven lens. She didn't have to wonder long. One frosty morning, while Clara was brushing Storm in the barn, she heard heated voices near the entrance. Slipping quietly from the stall, she found Everett in conversation with a stranger in a long, dark coat and polished boots. The stranger had a confident posture that bordered on arrogance. Something about his air made Clara's skin prickle. "I'm prepared to make a substantial offer," he was saying, his voice resonant but cold. "This horse has garnered significant acclaim, and with proper marketing, he could become a high-level contender." Everett folded his arms, shaking his head. "Not for sale," he replied flatly. "He's part of our family now." The man's expression hardened. "Don't be hasty," he pressed. "Think of what you could do with the funds. Upgrades to your ranch, opportunities for your daughter. Name your price." Clara felt a surge of outrage, recalling how Storm had once been viewed as a worthless commodity. She stepped forward, standing by Everett's side, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Storm isn't a thing," she said. "He's not some trophy to be passed around." The stranger gave her a once-over, eyes flicking to the stable behind her. "I respect your sentiment," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But a horse with that kind of potential belongs in a professional training circuit. You're wasting his gifts by keeping him here." Everett's face hardened, but his voice remained polite. "We've seen how he thrives, and we'll decide what's best for him. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Realizing his offer was unwelcome, the stranger sighed, then handed Everett a business card with an elegant logo. "Should you change your mind," he said, turning to leave, "don't hesitate to call. Horses like him don't come along often." The instant he was gone, Everett glanced at Clara, relief evident in his eyes. "I told you the more attention he gets, the more people like that will come around," he muttered. Clara nodded, stepping back into the barn where Storm waited. She pressed her cheek to his warm neck, anger simmering at the notion that anyone would treat him like a mere object. Despite the unsettling visit, life on the ranch continued with the steady rhythms of winter. Clara kept Storm's routine consistent, mindful that changes in weather or daily structure could stir his old insecurities. He seemed content, so long as Clara was near and the environment stayed predictable. Everett, watching the two of them work together, sometimes wore an expression that mingled pride with a father's worry. "I'm not against you aiming for bigger things," he said one evening as they stood in the barn aisle. "But folks will try to tempt you, to take him away, or promise a professional stable that claims it can do better. Don't let them rattle you." Clara's jaw set with determination. "I won't," she promised. "We'll stay true to what Storm needs, even if that means turning down flashy opportunities." Still, the question nagged at her. Could Storm truly excel in advanced competitions without risking his peace of mind? She mulled over the stranger's harsh words about Storm's potential. Though she despised the man's attitude, she couldn't deny that Storm possessed natural talent. His form over fences, his quick intelligence, and the intangible spark in his eyes. Clara began compiling a list of smaller shows in the region, ones that offered a supportive atmosphere rather than cutthroat rivalry. Even if they never aimed for the highest tiers, she believed these experiences would enrich Storm's confidence. Everett agreed to help her research, and they spent winter evenings by the fireplace, poring over schedules and entry forms. Reuben, too, provided his practical wisdom, cautioning them about travel logistics in icy months. "Better to pick a few safe events than chase every invitation," he'd say, and Clara found sense in his measured approach. At last, winter's grip began to loosen. Days grew subtly longer, and rivulets of meltwater trickled through the pasture. The ranch's muddy patches swelled, then receded into soft, budding grass. Clara felt a renewed spark as she prepared Storm for spring. Their final winter ride in the paddock was a gentle canter over slushy ground, Storm's breath billowing in soft clouds. Clara laughed as he shook his head, sending droplets of melting snow flying. She glanced toward the creek, still partly iced over, and remembered that night of the flood. In her mind's eye, she saw Storm plunging in, risking his life for hers, forging a bond that not even the most persistent cynic could break. That memory guided her forward, fueling her resolve to nurture Storm's well-being above any ambition others might push upon them. Beyond the ranch fence, the horizon stretched wide and bright, promising a season of fresh possibilities. Clara closed her eyes, inhaling the crisp air, silently vowing that no matter how far they went, they would do it their way, together, on a path lit by trust rather than greed. Spring arrived at Briar Creek Ranch with a joyous flourish. Soft rains gave life to new grass, and the orchard trees blossomed in delicate pinks and whites. The crisp wind that once carried winter's bite now felt gentle against Clara's cheeks whenever she led Storm along the ranch's sun-warmed paths. Their daily rides grew longer, winding through fields dappled with fresh wildflowers. Gone was the time when the stallion balked at every strange noise or panicked at a sudden movement. In its place was a quiet assurance that no matter the challenge, he could rely on Clara's calm guidance to see him through. The winter's hush, with all its cautious practices and slow-building trust, had done wonders for their bond. With the brighter weather came invitations to more spring events. Though they'd fielded offers from the pushy buyer who viewed Storm solely as profit, Clara and Everett remained steadfast. Storm was not for sale. Instead, Clara focused on smaller competitions in neighboring towns, where the atmosphere was supportive and low pressure. One by one, they attended these local shows, turning heads every time Storm trotted gracefully into a ring. A hushed admiration would settle over the crowd, especially when spectators whispered that this confident bay stallion had once been cast aside, deemed vicious and unrideable. For Clara, each outing was less about ribbons and more about reinforcing to Storm that the wider world offered neither punishment nor harm, only new experiences to conquer alongside a rider who believed in him completely. One bright afternoon, Reuben returned from errands with news of a special invitational slated for late spring. The event promised a friendly mix of show jumping and horsemanship clinics, with participants spanning from novices to advanced riders. Although it wasn't a top-tier championship, it carried enough prestige to attract skilled horsemen and a fair amount of public interest. When Clara read the flyer, an excited flush colored her cheeks. She remembered the official at the Winter Gala, praising Storm's potential for bigger things. Perhaps this invitational would be the perfect place to test their progress without plunging him into the intensity of a major circuit. After all, Storm had shown glimpses of real prowess over fences. Why not challenge him with a slightly more competitive environment? Everett, ever the concerned father, wanted thorough preparations. Over the next weeks, he and Reuben helped Clara raise jumps in the ranch's practice arena, slowly increasing the height. Storm started with simple cross rails, then moved on to slightly taller verticals. Clara kept close watch, ensuring he never felt rushed. Each time Storm cleared a new obstacle, they finished with lavish praise, letting him rest, and only then attempting another. The repeated success buoyed Clara's confidence. Storm's jumps were becoming smoother, his arcs over the rails more balanced. Occasionally, he knocked a pole with a hind hoof, the clatter startling him. But each time, Clara reassured him with a steady voice, and they tried again until he calmly cleared the jump without flinching. In her gut, Clara sensed that Storm loved the challenge, ears pricking forward at the sight of each obstacle, as if eager to prove himself. Before they knew it, the invitational weekend had arrived. Clouds drifted across a mellow sky, neither threatening rain nor blazing with relentless sun, a gentle weather forecast that suited Storm's sometimes edgy temperament. Loading him into the trailer felt almost routine now. He stepped up after a single nervous snort, as though reminding Clara he still had ghosts in his past, but was ready to move forward. The drive led them past rolling meadows and farms brimming with springtime vitality. Clara closed her eyes at times, recalling the night Storm saved her from the raging creek. She could still feel the frantic tumble of water and the stallion's powerful presence, fighting the current to keep her afloat. The memory, once frightening, now filled her with gratitude and awe. They arrived at the Invitational Grounds, a sprawling venue with a central show arena, multiple warm-up rings, and rustic stables for visiting horses. Bright flower boxes adorned the jumps, their vibrant colors accentuating the green field. Riders navigated courses at various heights, from small beginner fences to more advanced combos. The hum of conversation and the steady clip-clop of hooves on packed dirt created an ambience of friendly competition. Clara and Storm garnered curious glances, likely from those who'd heard whispers of his past heroism or read about his transformation in that regional article months ago. After checking in, Clara led Storm around to let him absorb the environment. He eyed the array of flags flapping in the breeze, but kept his stride calm, leaning into Clara's guiding hand on the reins. "Look at him," Reuben muttered, standing by Everett. "A year ago, that banner alone would have had him rearing." Everett nodded, remembering the frightened horse who wouldn't let a stranger within 10 feet. Now, Storm stepped through the bustle of competitors and onlookers with remarkable composure. Once they reached the warm-up ring, Clara mounted him carefully, double-checking his girth and bridle. She felt his muscles tense briefly when a nearby rider took a noisy jump, but he settled as soon as she spoke. Together, they trotted a large circle, weaving around other horses without fuss. Soon, the announcer called for participants in the mid-level jumping class. That was their category. A course of 8 fences, none impossibly high, but with enough complexity to challenge a horse that lacked experience in busier rings. Clara guided Storm toward the in-gate, heart fluttering. She saw Everett and Reuben leaning over the fence, faces taut with anticipation. A hush of suspense settled over Clara's mind as she recalled every step of their training. Storm had never let her down. She stroked his neck, inhaled, then rode forward when the steward waved them in. The ring was a vivid tapestry of color, bright rails, flower baskets, and painted standards. Spectators lined the edges, some flipping through programs, others snapping photos. Storm's ears flicked back and forth at the murmurs and the sudden metallic clang of a gate closing. Clara felt a tremor of tension through the reins, but she breathed out slowly, allowing a moment for him to absorb the new surroundings. Then she urged him into a collected canter, each hoofbeat syncing with her heartbeat. The first jump approached, a striped vertical with cheerful blue and white rails. Storm's stride lengthened on cue, and he soared over the fence with a clean snap of his knees. Applause rippled from the sidelines, fueling Clara's excitement. They rounded a corner to the second fence, a modest oxer. Storm tucked his legs neatly, clearing it with room to spare. The third and fourth jumps came in quick succession, requiring a tight turn that tested Clara's steering. Storm tossed his head at the abrupt angle, but he complied, springing over the rails. Next came a short stretch to the fifth obstacle, a taller vertical with bright floral arrangements. Perhaps spooked by the sudden splash of color, Storm braced himself at the last second, clipping the rail as they flew. The bar clattered to the ground, startling him. His ears flattened momentarily, and Clara felt him tense as though preparing to veer away. She murmured softly, maintaining gentle pressure on the reins, guiding him straight. Storm recovered, regaining a balanced canter. Determined not to lose momentum, Clara aimed him at the 6th and 7th fences. He cleared both without further mishaps, though she felt the lingering unease in his stride. The final jump loomed, an oxer with decorative wings shaped like blooming flowers. The crowd seemed to lean forward as Storm's canter quickened. Despite the earlier knockdown, Clara sensed his courage rally. At the last stride, Storm coiled his muscles and launched skyward, clearing the rails with a smooth arc that sent the onlookers into delighted cheers. Clara patted his neck fervently, beaming. Though not a flawless round, they had that one rail down. Storm had shown resilience and heart in the face of distraction. Riding out of the ring, Clara caught sight of Everett, who waved enthusiastically. Reuben tipped his hat in approval, a grin lighting his usually stern features. Storm blew hard through his nostrils, sweat darkening patches of his coat, but he held his head high, scanning the stands as though acknowledging the applause. Out of breath, Clara hopped off, loosening his girth and offering quiet praise. They wouldn't place first with a knocked rail, but to her, that hardly mattered. Storm had conquered the course, and more importantly, his own doubts. Back at the stables, a smattering of other riders came by to congratulate them. Clara appreciated their kind words, noticing genuine respect in their eyes. One older woman, leaning on the stable door, confessed she'd followed Storm's story since hearing how he rescued Clara. "He's a testament to kindness," she said, patting the stallion's shoulder. "When given a real chance, animals can surprise us all." That sentiment resonated deeply with Clara. In Storm, she saw the living proof that a being once labeled broken could transform given enough love and patience. After the class concluded and official results were posted, Clara discovered they'd come in 5th place overall, a respectable finish. She smiled at Storm, offering him a slice of apple. He crunched contentedly, showing no sign of disappointment. Around them, final rounds wrapped up and the event began winding down. The sun dipped low, bathing the grounds in a warm, golden glow. Everett and Reuben approached with the trailer, both men wearing expressions of unfiltered pride. "Good job, partner," Everett said, giving Storm's neck a fond rub. "And you too, Clara." She felt her heart stir with a deep sense of accomplishment. Just a year ago, Storm was the horse no one wanted, a creature trapped by fear and labeled dangerous. Now he stood among accomplished competitors, forging a path not just for himself, but for every underdog who dared to hope for redemption. They drove home at twilight, content in the knowledge that each new step paved the way to a more promising future. Upon arriving, Clara led Storm to his stall, removing his travel wrap and brushing him down until he gleamed under the lantern light. In the hush of the barn, she pressed her forehead to his, whispering words of gratitude and promise. Though they hadn't taken home a blue ribbon, they'd secured something far more precious: the knowledge that unconditional belief could triumph over fear. Storm breathed warmly against her cheek, and in that moment, Clara realized it didn't matter how many competitions they won or which events lay in their future. What mattered was that in each other, they had found a bond strong enough to heal old wounds, bright enough to light the way forward, and brave enough to leap any obstacle, both in and out